Good afternoon from Geneva. My name is Jun Lee from Accessions Division at the WTO Secretariat. I am delighted to be your moderator today for this session 6 roundtable on facilitating a WTO accession, the role of chairperson. This session is a part of Accessions Week that Secretariat Accessions Division is organizing during this week, composing 10 sessions. For example, from the previous session this morning, there was a very encouraging and solid point made by the Russian Federation delegate, Ekaterina. She said, WTO can deal with unusual and unique situations. Then I thought, indeed, our chairpersons are the ones who are in the forefront of this important dealing. Today, we are extremely fortunate to have 3 distinguished current and former chairpersons of accession working parties. Let me briefly introduce them one by one. First, Ambassador Luis Enrique Chavez Basagoitia is currently the chairperson of the Working Party on the Accession of Union of the Comoros. Ambassador Chavez was in Geneva as the permanent representative of the Mission of Peru until recently. Currently, he is Director General of Multilateral and Global Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Peru. Thank you so very much, Ambassador, for joining us from Lima, just starting at good morning with this session. Second, Ambassador Andrew Staines. He is currently the chairperson of the Working Party on the Accession of the Bahamas, and he is the Deputy Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom in Geneva. He has previously worked as a director in the World Intellectual Property Organization, as the first Secretary for Trade Policy in the British Embassy to the United States in Washington, D.C. Thank you so very much, Ambassador, for joining us despite your very busy agenda. Last but not least, Ambassador Joachim Rider. He was a former chairperson of the Working Party on the Accession of Liberia. Currently, he is Group External Affairs Director, Executive Vice President, Vodafone Group. Before this, Joachim was the Deputy Secretary General of UNCTAD. Thank you so very much, Ambassador Rider, for coming back to the WTO community and joining us from Sweden, despite your very busy agenda. Now, the objective of this roundtable is to understand one very particular actor of the entire WTO accession process. That is the chairperson. Today, we aim at engaging in a dialogue to signify how crucial and somewhat decisive the role of chairperson can be in moving an accession along, overcoming hurdles. With this, let me enter to our kickoff dialogue stage. Currently, we have about 50 attendees. Thank you all for that. So, ambassadors, first question to you all. In my view, the commonality of you 3 is that you all wanted to become Accessions Working Party chairperson. That motivation brought us all here for this session. So let me ask you, why were you interested in becoming Accession Working Party chairperson in the first place? What was your main driving motivation? We would love to know your background behind story on this. We will first start with Ambassador Chavez, followed by Ambassador Staines, finally Ambassador Rider. Ambassador Chavez, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, June. Good morning, you all. Joachim, good to see you. Andrew, again. Thank you. Well, to be quite honest, My case is quite peculiar. I was not looking after that position specifically, I must confess. Actually, I was approached by the Secretariat because there was a kind of impasse around the chair of this working group who was about to restart. And basically, what the acceding country, the Union of Comoros, wanted is to work in French. And but they did not want to work with a representative from a developed country. Basically, that was the thing. And from membership, they were ready to accept someone from a developing country, but not from the same region of the acceding country. So that narrowed down pretty much the scope of possible candidates, and actually the Secretariat proposed actually to chair this working group. Now, why I gladly accepted must be the question, for two reasons. First, well, I'm a civil servant, so I've been trained to do what I'm asked to do. If someone thinks I can be helpful somewhere, well, I think it's my duty. But on the other side, I took this as a challenge because I was quite new in Geneva, and even though I worked for a number of years in multilateral organizations, I was completely new to WTO when I was asked to chair. So I was completely out of my comfort zone, and maybe that was the element that triggered my interest. That was completely new. And I thought that if members consider that I may help, I thought that it could also be a challenge for me and an occasion also to discover something new. And I actually did. I'm very glad that this occasion appeared, and the Secretariat thought about me, and certainly of the confidence given to me by the Comoros and membership at large. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Staines.
Well, thank you very much, June. A very good morning, very good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you very much, June, including for a fabulous Accessions week this week. So look, for me, it's been a real career highlight, if I may say, to be the chairperson of the Bahamas Working Group. And it was a deep honor to be approached and suggested as someone that might be able to play my own small role in their journey as they move forward on their accession journey. And that was for a bunch of reasons, I'm sure, not least the fact that the UK and the Bahamas have had a very long-standing friendship, partnership that's really stood the test of time. And so I was very, very honored to be asked to support them in their accession process. I think if I may say more generally, look, we all have a collective job to move the world trading system towards more universal membership. I think if we really want everyone to realize the benefits of trade, then we need to move towards as broad a membership as possible of the WTO. That, of course, I think is even more true as we come out of the COVID crisis. So as part of our sort of building back, I think accessions play a very big role in that. In terms of the accession that I chair, the Bahamas is the last nation state in the Western Hemisphere outside of the WTO. And so someone that likes maps, there was certainly also a sort of piece of the jigsaw that was left to do. And then finally, I think, I've been fortunate enough to attend the last 4 WTO ministerials. I've been in Geneva for the past decade. It's not been the easiest decade for the organization. But I think accessions have sort of been one of the real bright lights in that period. I think with all of the various challenges that we know are out there, I think it's actually a really, really positive sign to us all, and actually a good reminder to the WTO membership that there are a queue of aspiring members that want to join the organization. So I think it's also a real show of confidence in the WTO, in the rules-based system more generally. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Rider?
My dear colleagues have covered a lot, so I'll just add the peculiarities of my own motivations beyond the general ones that they have raised. Much like Andrew, I mean, Sweden had an important relationship and still has an important relationship with Liberia, and it was the first country that Sweden deployed a military force since 1809. So having not so it was a big shift in Sweden's engagement internationally, and for that reason Sweden was heavily invested into the peace process, the rebuilding efforts, and fundamentally reinserting and supporting Liberia in any way possible to get back into the international fold, international community, and give it a fair chance. And I was very happy to be accepted by Liberia and also supported by Sweden and accepted by the broader membership, because that was something that I felt was very important to do. The civil war in Liberia was absolutely devastating, among the worst that you probably could ever imagine, and Liberia needed a fair chance, and I was very honored to try to play a role in that. The second thing, if I can be a little bit honest and do a bit of promotion for the accessions, like Andrew, I mean, it's a little trade policy and trade negotiations can be a little bit esoteric at times, and accessions don't have that. Whatever you do, the rubber hits the road. You are going to sit with the acceding member on the various concessions that they're considering as part of their membership, and it has real life consequences for the country in question, including its citizens, its businesses, and the like. And to have visibility of that and to learn from that and understand the difficult trade-off that in this case an LDC goes through in trying to integrate itself into the world trading system, a rules-based system, which is significantly positive for a country, but it's actually quite a difficult process. And I wanted to also have that experience and try to make my contribution to that. So that's the main reasons why I felt, over and beyond what the colleagues said, that drove me to be very attractive to the opportunity to try to help Liberia specifically. But I would like to echo what the colleagues said in terms of the importance of continually driving the rules-based system and making sure that all countries have a fair chance of playing under rules as opposed to pure power play. And that's one of the ways, it's one of an incredible insurance policy that all nations are equal in a rules-based system, which is one of the major advantages that countries are seeking to achieve through their accession, as well as propelling their development and their economic prosperity. So it's a very, very important process. And for that reason, I was extremely happy, over and above my other assignments in WTO, to have also involved myself in Liberia's accession.
Thank you very much. Up front, that all of you have done some great promotions for the multilateral trading system through accessions. It's amazing. It's so fascinating to hear all of your motivations. Some of them we didn't know that are somewhat resonating with each other. In fact, there are commonalities indeed. All of you seem to be very happy to do this job, and also somewhat unique for each one of you. Thank you so much for this kick-off response. Now I think I will move to a specific question to Ambassador Rider, Joachim. So Joachim, amongst the three chairs today, you are the only one who finished Chairperson's mandate officially. As the acceding government that you helped, that is Liberia, became the WTO member in July 2016. Also, you are one of the luckiest chairpersons, if I may say so, who indeed fully led the the accession process from the very critical moment of reactivation until the very final conclusion of the negotiation under your chairpersonship. You celebrated Liberia's, the first African continent accession in the WTO's 25 years history. You celebrated it in the ministerial conference in Nairobi, Kenya. So Joachim, now that about 5 years have passed since you have chaired the last meeting of the Working Party of Liberia, looking back, in your view, why do you think the role of chairperson is so important in WTO accession process? Can you give us a specific example that you yourself felt that your role as the chair was a critical mass to move forward to a next step in the accession process of Liberia? Back to you.
So thanks for the promotional video, the pitch prior to the question. But I mean, there are a number of reasons why I think Liberia moved very fast, despite under extraordinarily challenging circumstances. I mean, let's not forget they had Ebola in the midst of their accession, which was horrendous and devastating for the country. But if you narrow it down to the question, and I honestly think that the real champions of this process was the President's Relief Johnson, the mandate she gave to her chief negotiator, Honorable Minister Axel Addy, who was relentless in his drive to achieve accession, and shared my level of impatience, only to be matched by the then accession director, Chedu Sakwe, who is equally or was equally impatient and targeted. So it was a weird combo of three very impatient persons coming together, and I think. But if I look at my small role in that, I think there and what I think the chairmen can add to a process. Well, first, you're the guardian of the process. You facilitate the process. In that, you perform basically, in my view, three things. First, accession processes are a little bit convoluted and challenging in the sense that you have the new member or the incoming member, the acceding member. You have the existing membership, which have many competing priorities and deal with many competing files at the same time in negotiations. And then you have the secretariat, where you do have dedicated resources. So to triangulate these three constituencies, if I can put it like that, to be shepherding the process, injecting pace into it, but constantly bridging also the process. So the secretariat plays an incredibly important role in helping the acceding member understand what it needs to do. But the acceding member needs to shoulder the full responsibility of developing its market access offers and the like. What you as a chair can do is both coach them, land the messages that the secretariat needs to convey to the acceding members so they understand their homework, inject a sense of urgency, importance of what they're doing, but vice versa then also for your impartiality, and while you're selected by the membership, to actually drive the membership to put the right priority onto responding to the acceding members' offers and engage properly with that country. So one of the things I had to constantly do was basically to chase after ambassadors who was not responding fast enough to Axel Addy's latest revised offer, and to get them to respond and engage in a bilateral negotiation so that we could move forward. So I think that's one. The second one is, as a chairman and with your overview, and especially when you talk about poor and vulnerable economies like Liberia, you play a very important role to mobilize the necessary donor support for the country. So in my case, of course, there were a number of actors involved, but I was able to try to identify and help Liberia in their own advocacy around the type of need they needed to get to the donor community in various countries for their bilateral aid, but as well as international institutions, which helps to pace up and increases the capability of the country to do the accession. Because many times it's not lack of will, it's actually the sheer size of the work and the fact that it's an unknown territory for a country to go through where they lack the skills. You do need to have the right capacity building efforts in place. And the chairman can be a fantastic ambassador and advocate for support to the country. Then the third thing I would argue is that you come to a place for acceding members where they're getting towards the end point. And that's where you need to move it up at the top level, both from a cabinet meeting discussion as well as a parliamentary discussion. In the end, this has to be ratified by a parliament. So what me and the then acceding accession director, Chedu Sakwe, had to do, we traveled, of course, to Monrovia, and we played a role to create some shelter for the chief negotiator, for the type of concessions they've done, to socialize what actually accession means. Because once you go beyond the small circle of people that are devoted to this, even if you have a strong steer from the president, as in the case of Liberia, in the end, there is a broader buy-in in society that you need to achieve from the business sector, private sector, from the parliamentarians. And the chairman can play an important role representing the membership in that stage of actually explaining the importance of the accession process, explaining some of the concessions that are required, many of which are not because they're greedy members that ask for too much, but actually because this is how the rules are set in WTO and what purpose those rules are aimed to fulfill in terms of countries' development objectives. So in other words, it's not a concession, it's actually a tool for domestic reform and domestic development. And as a chairman, you play that role as a voice of the international rules-based system into local politics. And thereby you create also shelter for your chief negotiator to do the final concessions and get this over the line. So I think you do have these three, if I could describe them as three different roles in parallel that you need to execute, and which, by the way, makes the job really, really fun, if I can put it like that. But not to exaggerate, in the end, it is both the members and their willingness to put priority on it, the exceeding members' ability to make its concession, and ultimately, I would really stress the political will of the exceeding member combined with the expertise that it has through its chief negotiator that's going to drive it. But the chairman can be the lubricant for the process if the chairman is doing it well.
Fascinating. So you were a coach, you were a cushion, you were a shelter, so you were playing so many different roles. Your focus on Liberia indeed represented the particular challenges and solutions of exceeding post-conflict LDCs in general. And I must say it illustrated also how crucially and mindfully the role of chairperson needed to be deployed in navigating those sensitivities. I believe your personal commitments and drive has shaped the accession of Liberia to the final stage that overcame Ebola crisis then. You were modest in starting, but I must emphasize for our audience that your personal commitment was amazing. This accession provides us, Liberian accession, many insights to the current acceding governments, indeed, as you say, who are exceptionally committed under even current pandemic. That's really encouraging. Now, let me ask a question both to Andy and Luis. Both of you are currently chairing a small island economy accession, the Bahamas and Comoros. Based on our experience, limited experience from the Secretariat, facilitating such economies accession is rather challenging, as those economies' public opinions tend to be relatively very critical and sometimes very cynical towards the WTO and the multilateralism in general. So question to you, Ambassador Staines and Chavez, what is your take on this specific challenge in your accession? In your view, how best can a chair tackle this type of challenges? What kind of skill set are being required from the chair, or what kind of toolbox are being utilized by the chair? Maybe we can start hearing from Andy and then Luis. Back to you.
Sure, thank you very much. I think I'll continue where Joachim left off, actually, which is I think the job of a chairperson is very much in two directions. I mean, every accession is unique, and I think that's something that's you know, was less clear to me before I became a chair. But I think once I became a chair, that became very, very obvious. Members that are small island developing states, small and vulnerable economies, I think bring a particularly unique set of circumstances to the table. So the first half of my job, I think, is to help illuminate those differences to the WTO membership at large. Of course, many WTO members understand them and they're in a similar position themselves, but not everyone does. And so I think there is an education, an enlightening-like process. When I look at the accession the working party that I oversee, the Bahamas, I mean, this is an archipelago, 700 islands, 100,000 square miles of ocean. It's the highest point is about 60 meters above sea level. 80% of the archipelago is below a meter above sea level. So this is this is a fabulous, beautiful, unique place. But it's also one where until you go and visit, until you meet and have detailed dialogues, you don't understand the sort of, you know, even in a fairly small economy in terms of population, the huge diversity across the citizens, across the stakeholders in the accession. And sort of, you know, I think once you get out of the capital Nassau into the family islands, the situation is often very different. So I think, firstly, there is explaining that, you know, helping WTO members who are considering this session understand the circumstances that are going on back in the acceding member. Part of it is also, I think, you know, particularly smaller members, resource constraints are clearly always a challenge. And so I think there is an honest two-way conversation with the members, with the acceding member, in terms of creating the space to allow sort of proper, timely responses to questions, and to ensuring that actually when the member actually really goes above and beyond and turns around those questions, that the WTO membership really then responds to them and reacts to them and moves the process forward. So I very much hear and echo Joachim's point around the sort of harassing, I think he's a more diplomatic word, ambassadors in Geneva to respond and engage. And I think that is in many ways the other part of the job, which is to turn back to the acceding member themselves and help them understand the Geneva community. And so I think there is I think in many countries, you know, you can look at these big multilateral organizations, and from afar they feel monolithic, they feel sort of very powerful. It can feel like it is, you know, the WTO sending instructions down to someone to do something or not do something. And so I think there is a job that is particularly true. Eugene alluded to public opinion, which is just helping the acceding member, supporting them to work with their stakeholders to understand the process, to understand that actually, you know, most, if not all, decisions are in the hands of the acceding member. So this is part of a reform journey. You know, this is not about a sort of an acquis that gets handed down from Geneva. This should be about a sort of broader reform journey that's in the interests of the acceding member. It's, you know, it's a two-way process. It is a negotiation, but also I think, as Joachim said, to sometimes to indicate where actually there are tough decisions to be taken, and you know, there are things that need to be done. That, you know, the WTO has a rule book for good reason, and so therefore I think there's sometimes also where the chairperson can be that neutral interlocutor between what sometimes looks like a Geneva community that's thousands of miles away, into the acceding member that's got the time and the interest and the relationships to have that conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Chavez?
Thank you, June. Well, difficult to add something new to what has been said. That's the problem in taking the floor last. But in the case of the Comoros, and what is my personal feeling, I think that this is the idea here, to engage into eventually more personal dialogue. The case of those small islands, I think everything goes around the world small. So everything's small. And that's a problem, because that creates actually great imbalances. So I don't dare to say that a public opinion in the case of the Comoros is reluctant to access WTO. But I must say that they are concerned, because at the end of the day, what we are asking them is to bring tremendous changes in the way their economies are organized, in exchange of potential benefits they cannot see at this moment. So basically, the thing is to not to convince them, because they're convinced, but to reinforce the faith actually they have in the international system. And this is key. This is a matter of faith, basically, and say, well, this is not a negotiation. Actually, this is a process whereby the acceding country has to adapt itself to the world system. And it is not that easy, because, as I said, everything's small. If you have small economy, trade-offs are rather unbalanced. And I understand that there are matters of principle, but if you look at what the Comoros actually represent for international trade, there shouldn't be major difficulties to for members actually to make important concessions. But sometimes it is understandable you hit the wall because there are red lines as a matter of principle. This is not about figures. This is an unbalance by nature. It is an unbalanced process. So that's very different. Small economies also mean small budgets. And it is not a minor detail. Participation it's very complicated. We actually had to ask for a sponsorship, and we thank some members who actually have supported and are still supporting this process. But again, it is sometimes also complicated if you don't have resources how to participate. Small means also small administrations. Even though they're willing to accede, in most cases, it has been very difficult to meet the deadlines and to produce documents, because this is also accession. It's about a lot of paperwork. You have to produce documents, and when you have small administrations, it's not that easy. I have to praise the role of the Secretariat at this stage, because with this type of processes, it's fair to say that without the Secretariat, without that technical support, it would be simply impossible to meet the criteria. And finally, small island, small economies is also connected in most cases to also small institutions, and that becomes an unpredictability. Maybe one of the biggest challenges we face actually was the loss of momentum we managed to create when the government decided to introduce some constitutional changes that disrupted actually the sequence we have foreseen. And well, then difficulties also pop up. It became suddenly another process with another timing and other circumstances. So these were, let's say, all the challenges deriving from this particular condition: small island, small economy, small administration. But on the right side, as I said, the Secretariat helped, members helped, and let's say the external conditions also used to help, but now I'm afraid they are having also a negative impact in the process, as everything within WTO seems to run on a slower pace. But this is life. There are cycles, and if my contribution is precisely to keep faith, to keep the process alive despite all those circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, ambassadors. It's amazing to realize how deeply you understand the accession country that you are leading. It's a very telling, and I'm sure our audience is feeling exactly that. That's the very reason why sometimes in the accessions process there are, as Luis, you rightly said, so there are setbacks, but through your energy, I think we are all able to come back to the track, which is amazing. Now, can I move to my next question? My next question goes to Joachim, who is currently working in a private sector. I would like to touch base on the necessity of, let's say, engaging, partnering with the private sector in the accession process. Interestingly, in every single session so far during this accession week, if there is a one terminology that every single time came up in the accession session, it was a private sector. Now that you are professionally engaged in a private sector, on top of your vast experience in public domain, what would be your advice to the auxiliary government that are, let's say, maybe criticized by the general public, particularly by business sector, whether big or small, as they somewhat tend to believe the government's undertakings, especially in WTO accession negotiations, are not necessarily transparent or not inclusive? How can chair, if play a better role in connecting to the private sector during the accession process? Over to you, Joachim.
So in the case of Liberia, that started actually before the accession process. As with many countries, changing the status quo is painful, and you will have a lot of vested interests that are worried, and usually private sector is not necessarily helpful, to be perfectly honest, when it comes to change. But Louise is absolutely right. I see accession, the real strength of an accession is not what type of, I mean, it's basically twofold. Number one is that you become part of a family of countries that devote themselves to rule of law. So you can use the fact that you rely on international public law as a means of improving your own rules-based system domestically. And it becomes a stickiness. So the usual problem in many countries is that there will be a lot of volatility around the type of legislative changes that you do. So from a private sector point of view, you're investing on the basis of one thing, and then 3 years later, something else applies. And it's actually devastating from the point of view of trying to attract investments, which, while we talk a lot about trade, actually one of the key drivers of development is foreign direct investment. And oftentimes it goes hand in hand with trade, but it's the foreign direct investment that starts unlocking the building of domestic productive capacity, which then generates the trade and export earnings subsequently. So an understanding investment is about understanding the role of law and rule of law as a way of driving predictability, which is the way of driving investor attractiveness. And I think WTO offers, because it's a rules-based system, it offers that you embed international public law to some extent into your national legal system. And it creates, therefore, the confidence of the private sector in this, of investing, both domestic and foreign, by the way, because domestic investors also under-index on their investment because they are afraid of losing the assets that they have built up. And that's why you see a number of private sector in developing countries preferring to put the money in savings account in Monaco as opposed to reinvesting into the economy. So there is something about the fundamental aspect of that. The second thing is when it comes to the market access bit and opening up the economy, which is not the rules per se, it is the market access or commitments that you do. That is much more tricky because it is it can be quite a drastic change in the current fabric of the economic setup. So when you open up an economy, and I actually personally think that that was one of the challenges we had with the overall WTO membership, because if you approach things from a trade negotiating point of view, yet another market access round in the WTO, you're talking about incremental changes to a well-established tariff schedule. When you're talking about an exceeding member, you're talking from a country going from 0 to 60 miles per hour in no time, not especially from a historical development of a country. And that's a very significant structural adjustment of an economy. And structural adjustment in economies that lack cushioning welfare systems or cushioning systems to address the displacement that happens either by business or by citizens are in trouble. And I actually think that the WTO and the WTO process did not offer enough opportunity to discuss that and to socialize the implication. And I must say, I mean, I wasn't in all humility, I wasn't too aware of it either. I remember in one of the negotiating sessions when one of the members were really beating up Liberia over transport services. Why the hell do you not make a commitment on transport services? And to be frank, I couldn't understand it either. And I was putting a lot of pressure on the negotiating team of Liberia saying, but why on earth would you hold this out? I mean, I just don't get it. Don't you want investment into the transport sector? It would strike me as very important. It just happens that because of the post-conflict situation in Liberia, one of the ways they couldn't afford psychological help for all the soldiers that have fought, many of which were underage. So what they did was the veterans out of the Civil War, they allowed them a monopoly on motorcycle taxis. And why did they allow the monopoly onto motorcycle taxis? Because on motorcycle taxi, you hug the person that is driving the taxi. So there's an emotional connection that helps rebuild the psyche of the war veterans that were many times children, in an absence of a social welfare system that would give them the help to address post-traumatic stress syndrome and other horrible experiences they've gone through. But it takes some time actually to understand that. And it doesn't come obvious if you're like me, growing up in Stockholm and haven't really lived in a country of war. But once the penny drops, you do need to address that and understand that there are no-go areas because the structural adjustment and the way that the economy is being set up, but actually to socialize that. So I think for me, from a private sector point of view, where I sit now, I would say that separate the rule of law aspect from the market access aspect. Understand that the market access leads to structural adjustment, which means a change, which is necessary to drive productivity. But you do need to do it in a reasonable way if a country lacks the normal systems of cushioning that all rich countries enjoy immensely. And for that reason, you do need to be quite smart about how you time your commitments, but also identify the things that you may not want to make a commitment on right now because of the specific circumstances you're in. And that's something where you need to work with the private sector, smoke them out, frankly, on when there are legitimate interests, like the one on the taxi monopoly, versus things which are just vested interests that undermines the competitiveness and productivity of the economy as a whole. And therein as well, the Liberian government worked very intensely with foreign investors to also try to build a narrative, much like Luis referred to. It's not a hope. You can move it from a hope to something concrete if you actually have a plan working with investors on the type of investments that could come if you have more predictability around your rule of law. But it is a lot of work, and I'm not going to say that it's always easy with the private sector, because of course the private sector, once you have assets, you want to protect them. And if you have structural adjustments, you run the risk of losing value of assets, and therefore private sector can be quite complicated people to deal with. On the other hand, when it comes to the opportunities, and particularly that's why I think Liberia had a very strong vision on their domestic reform program. It wasn't about, purely export driven. It was about the need for Liberia to put itself on a development path and to drive increased economic efficiency so that people had a chance of having better development. And once you sell it like that, as opposed to selling it as a hypothetical negotiation where you're going to get access to other people's market, which frankly is not the main selling point, then it starts making sense. But you do need to be very careful and thoughtful about how you go about it, and really try to disentangle where the private sector makes relevant points versus when they're just trying to protect status quo at the detriment of citizens' development.
Thank you very much, Joachim. I trust your wisdom in this regard has been really well noted and can be applicable not only to the ongoing accession, but to that matter, any trade negotiations in general. Now, time is going very well. Now, my next question is to all of our three speakers. Here, I very much like to touch upon the very uniqueness of chairing WTO accessions. For example, as like the long duration of the accession negotiation, what is quite different from chairing other bodies is duration. It is not just one-time chairing or even one semester or so. It is really about longer term commitment from chair side and often chair's government side. Indeed, a few years of your lifetime has been invested into the accession process of a country that you may not really know before. So now my question to you, all of you, from your experiences and perspectives, what are the distinctive characteristics of chairing accessions working party compared to the other chairmanship in the WTO or even other international organization? I know Ambassador Chavez has tremendous experience in chairing in other organizations as well. What are the lessons that you want to draw from this uniqueness so that, maybe it's a big ground question, but so that multilateral trading system can better serve acceding governments, as well as members, and we cherish this process as something exclusive, positive, and you have all said that it was a happy moment to take up on this job. So Ambassador Chavez will have the floor first, followed by Ambassador Saindes, and then Ambassador Rider. You have the floor, Ambassador Chavez.
Thank you, June. Well, I think you said a lot already. Technically, first, what makes this process unique is the model for negotiation. So this is unique because we did not negotiate an accession process the way we negotiate anything else, almost anywhere else. So it is a unique combination of multilateral plus bilateral negotiations. And the role of the chair varies depending on where you stand. So in my case, at least, and at this stage of the process, I've been especially focused on the process itself, let's say on the organization aspect, because as you said in the beginning, the better you organize your meeting, the most likely a successful outcome becomes. So this is basically my approach, but so far, there's still a long run ahead, okay? But if I should put some keywords, as in any other multilateral negotiation and as in any other aspects in life, you know, life is not a quiet pond. There are problems, and we have to face problems, and problems tend to be unforeseen in general, and of course, and therefore we have to use our imagination. But your imagination tends to be much more stimulated when you are deeply committed to something. So I think these are the things. So you need political will that brings commitment, and you need some creativity. But certainly the uniqueness, you gave us a hint, it's also in the long term. The time frame for this process is quite unique. Normally, in any other multilateral process, or if, let's say you have foreseeable time frames. This is not the case. This is really not the case, and this is highly unpredictable. So how to overcome this difficulty? Well, on the side of the chair and the secretariat, I think is the key word is, as I said, continuity and perseverance. You have to keep track, basically. This is the job of the chair. You have to be there. You have to remind the parties, and in particular, acceding country, what are their commitments, what they have to do, and to keep track. So this are to me the specifics for this process. But as I said, I did not complete the process. So maybe my colleagues here could add other elements. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, Andy.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I think what makes a working party chair unique? I think for me, I'll highlight three different things. The first, June, you touched on, which is the duration, and I think it's particularly unique and actually a real pleasure and delight, because you get to work very closely with one acceding member. You know, of course, you're working with the whole membership, but you have the opportunity to make contacts, to make friends in the acceding member, which is a real joy, and get to know a country. Certainly, in my case, I knew a little about the Bahamas, but I know much more about it now, and so I've developed some real friendships and a real love of that country. Secondly, and Ambassador Chavez touched on this, the process is pretty unique in itself, and I think as well as the sort of the mix of the multilateral, the plurilateral, and the bilateral, it's probably the only process in the WTO where you get to work across the entire WTO acquis, and you do market access. I mean, we don't do market access much in the WTO these days, so it's pretty rare to do a job where you get to, if you like, work and understand. It's a huge learning experience. Ambassador Chavez, I think, said at the start, it's sort of one where actually there are very few opportunities to sit in a meeting and cover the entire legal framework of the WTO, and with Accessions, you do that, and so certainly with my colleagues in London, in Geneva, I tell them to get involved in the sessions, because actually I think it's the one chance you have to really, grasp the whole spectrum of what the WTO does. June, if I may, we've got 10 minutes to go, so I think it's the moment. Also, the third unique thing I think is working very much with you and your team. It's one of the most fabulous teams in the WTO Secretariat, the fabulous teams in Geneva. Deputy Director General Wolf, Micah, Chedu before you, June, the rest of your team. This session is about the working party chairpersons. But I think, the real and often unsung heroes behind the chairpersons are the Secretariat. And so I think I'll just conclude by highlighting the very unique and important role that you and your colleagues play. Thanks.
Andy, you're so sweet. Thank you so much. I think for Joachim, the bar is higher now. You need to be sweeter.
No, it's lower, because I can just concur with my two previous colleagues. By the way, they're spot on, and because they have covered it, I can just add something on 30 seconds. The only remaining thing that I feel is unique and with fundamental lessons is that we psychologically, I'm not saying that that's the intent, but psychologically for the exceeding member, at times this can feel about like everyone against one. And we have to understand that psychological toll that it sometimes takes on the negotiating team of the exceeding member. And as a chairman, you rarely, in any other WTO process that I know, you don't really, well, TPRB has an element of it, but it's like shock therapy for 2 days, right? This is potentially, in the worst case, shock therapy for a very long time, psychologically. And to create then the patience, the longevity, the endurance of the negotiating team of the exceeding member is something that you as a chair is rarely exposed to in other WTO bodies, and to work with them. And that's why you hear Andrew, Louise, myself talking as we were partly in love with the countries that we are exceeding, because we create that emotional bond because of the setup is all against one. Right? So you as a chair work really with a country to sustain their effort through that whole process, but also you learn immensely about that country in the process. And I think that, so I would just want to highlight as one of the things that I think is under indexed in many negotiations, but really come to the fore in the chairman of Accessions, is that emotional intelligence, that emotional connection, which by the way is a glue for all negotiations. The understanding of fundamental red lines, the understanding of what is doable and not doable is something we should pay more attention in all negotiations, because it's key to find the compromise. But in Accession, you're really exposed to it as a chairman.
Thank you, Joachim. All of you have touched upon the very distinctive nature of the WTO accession, that is human story. You talked about real joy, love, family. Trade in WTO is not only about, I guess, numbers, tariffs, services, rules, etc. It is our story. So I think the audience feels that. I hope that the message comes across. Indeed, you must have been doing the exciting job. I can really feel it. You really serve for the system that we all benefit. Now I'm entering to the final stage of this session. My final question to you is about how to manage challenging situation. Up front, at the very beginning, you all have well articulated your strong motivations as to why you wanted to become, or it happened to become, but in the end, you are gladly taking it. So nonetheless, I presume there have been a moment or two or three that you as a chairperson felt that the accession process was so challenging, so demanding, either for you personally, for exceeding government, for members. So how have you managed those moments? I believe the audience want to hear some stories in this regard. So should we start, Andy, and then Joachim, finally, Louise, back to you.
Yes, absolutely. I think is the answer. I mean, the job of a chairperson is, you know, as far as the seating member, you know, would like you to, is to push, I think, and maintain momentum and build momentum. And that was sort of very much the case with the Bahamas. And then, you know, an event like Hurricane Dorian came along last year in the Caribbean, one of the biggest hurricanes to ever hit land. And that was, you know, utterly devastating. I mean, it was 200-mile-an-hour winds, tens of thousands of people left without homes. So I think that was, you know, clearly an external factor, but sort of a huge one for a country sort of grappling with a WTO accession. And so I think, of course, you know, first thoughts are with your colleagues, your friends, and their friends and families in the Bahamas and their safety. But of course, then there's a sort of much tougher conversation around rebuilding and what that looks like, and a very, you know, delicate conversation around the role of the WTO in that process. And I have to say, I came out of last year sort of very much taking that as a lesson for all of us in Geneva, which is, I think, actually, when you look at these big events, and, you know, this is clearly a extreme climate related event, but there are lots of others. You know, we here have got to get better at explaining the role of trade in supporting the response to these sort of crises, because until we can do that, we'll struggle to build support for trade in that process of rebuilding that very difficult situation. I mean, more generally, I think, like with any negotiation, you go through waves, and, you know, there are sort of high points and low points, be it on the rules side, be it on the market access side. And I think to some extent that's good and healthy. You know, tensions build up. You know, you bring up the most difficult points, and it gets a bit tough. And I think, as Joachim said earlier, sort of part of it is sort of reassuring both sides that kind of this is what the process is meant to do. You know, the process is meant to do that, to try and resolve issues and bring them to a conclusion. And so I think, you know, I think there are, of course, this sort of cyclical nature as different bits of the negotiations sort of rise and fall. And the role of the chair, I think, is very much sort of, as Joachim said, to sort of be in some ways the friend of the acceding member during that process and to support them through that process. Thanks.
Yeah, so in terms of the Liberia challenge was one, well, there were a few, but, and we've talked about the domestic resource constraints post-conflict, but the big one was Ebola. I mean, that threw us off the track in certain ways and in significant ways, and it was for an extended period of time, and with a very high level of threat, persistent threat to the health and safety of the Liberian negotiating team, and their ability to keep focused and to keep motivated and to whether or not to prioritize to this, frankly, as Andrew referred to, as, you know, when you're hit by something like that. I think from my point of view, I mean, that was there's always, when it comes to things like this, just like with COVID, because COVID is, in that sense, is sort of the same in a devastating health crisis, running havoc to the economy, to people's lives and livelihoods. And I think for me, it's always there is a point where the penny drops. And I think we all have that circumstance, for example, with COVID. For me, with Ebola, you know, it took a few months to fully understand the gravity of this situation. And for me, in COVID, it was when I saw all the cars through Bergamo, which filled from the beginning and to the end of the high street, all the trucks with the body bags being driven out of Bergamo, where you then no longer focus on the task at hand, but you become emotionally, in a very strong way, connected to the suffrage that your colleagues are going through locally. So it is excruciatingly difficult to do a process like this, an accession, under a health crisis. And I hope that members are mindful, for those members that are doing accession right now, that it's not a one-off, it's not a health crisis per se, even if it's a 1 year or 2 years. In the case of Ebola, 2 years. In the case of COVID, most likely 2 years as well, perhaps. But also the full ramifications on the fabric of society, how, you know, the vulnerability of the citizens, businesses that have gone under, how many functions of the government are stretched to the max, and understanding that and emotionally connecting with it, and therefore adjusting your expectations to address and to meet the exceeding member halfway. I think that's very, very important. And so for me, that was a very, very challenging period, I must say.
Thank you. Ambassador Chavez?
Yeah, thank you. I think I also can share most of the challenges that have been already raised by my colleagues. Basically, there is a one and permanent challenge that is to keep momentum all along the process. So, and this is not a small thing, but let me briefly mention some concrete challenges I had to face. And I'm sorry, this is unique, not only because of the nature of the acceding countries, but it's also unique as for any other negotiation because of the nature of the players. This as has also been mentioned. So apologies if I start talking about myself, but I already said that. Maybe in my case, the major challenge was actually to accept to chair this working group, because as you know, I was not acquainted with the WTO. So that was, I say, rather audacious to look after someone who was not an insider. So overcoming your own fears is maybe the main challenge, and it applies to me, and that makes me connect with actually the acceding country, because the acceding country has also to overcome its own fears, and how this monster looks like from inside. It's not reassuring, let me tell you. So that's one aspect. The second challenge or second moment, I said, was, I already mentioned it, I think, when the government of Comoros decided to introduce some constitutional reforms. And I think we lost momentum. I still wonder whether the process would have been completed without that at this stage. Because when we lose momentum, we lose also track with respect to the sequence of facts within WTO and other processes. So you have also to connect both the internal, the national level, and the international, in particular, the process within the WTO. Well, what the response to that type of challenge? Patience. This is a fact of life, and you have to try harder. Okay. And the third moment, that was a challenge, but also simply to show that challenges also bring opportunities for something new. This was the case of the last meeting of the working party. We faced financial difficulties, and therefore the presence of all those members of the Comoran delegation, their presence in Geneva was not assured. So at that moment, we started thinking outside the box, and what we introduced was this type of hybrid meetings, and somehow we inaugurated this type of work. So part of the meeting was taking place, when the meeting was taking place in Geneva, all the negotiating team was back in Moroni through internet, following and taking part in the process. And I think we pioneered with this practice in WTO. So this is to say that challenges are also opportunities that make us, let's say, become better persons, better negotiation, and finally a better organization. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much. Maybe let us now move to the Q&A box that we have received. Actually, out of 64 participants, we have received 3 questions. Some of them dealt already in your very good elaboration. So what I think is one question, particularly from Linjie, and I think Andy, you want to respond to this question. So let me read a question for the audience. If your country is involved into intensive bilateral negotiation with the acceding government you are chairing, what should you do? Andy, over to you.
Well, thanks for letting me go first. I'm learning how to use Zoom, and so I was sort of clicking wildly. But delighted to answer the question. It's not actually it's not my situation at present. So the UK is not negotiating themselves bilaterally with the Bahamas. But the answer, I think, is very clear, and it's true. I think for any chairing job, and it's one of the real joys in some ways of doing multilateral chairing roles, in that in this capacity I don't answer to my government. I answer to the WTO members. So I answer to my government only to the extent they are a member of the WTO. I am independent, and so in our case we'd very much put walls, if you like, between those different functions. And so a different part of our system would be in charge of that part of the process. And in that case, I would stay completely separate from that. I think it's also probably fair to say that most chairs are probably toughest on the delegation they know best. And so I think the sort of, in the event that it happened, I think you'd probably also find that most chairs can make sure their own delegation are following the rules to the absolute letter. But the simple answer is, I think it's perfectly possible. I think it does happen, but it's very much a sort of separation of roles, separation of powers.
Thank you, Andy. So if Linjie and Jeremy allowed, all of your questions we dealt already in the discussion. So let us now move to final keywords from each of us. Each of you, actually, not me. Keyword from you, 3 speakers, please, before we close the session. Keywords for chairing Accession Working Party. What would you say?
Well, let me start. And in my experience, keyword would be availability. The chair has to be there whenever he is required. And this is not simple, actually, to keep, because from the time I took over that was in 2013, I think, or 14. Then I had 2 postings. So I'm now I live in Lima, but I left Geneva to Bern. It was easy to keep track of the process from Bern to Geneva, but now we are doing this online. I'm still available. My government makes me available, but I think that should be also the keyword for as for any process. Everyone has to be available in permanent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andy?
Well, I was sort of debating a few words beginning with P in terms of the role of a chairperson. Certainly people and bringing people together, perspective and offering perspective on to both sides on what's really happening. Of course, process, procedure, goes without saying. Patience and perseverance, I think, has come out in this discussion, but is very, very important. But most of all, the final P, it's not power. We have a modest role, and it's one where it comes with very little conferred authority. But the final P would be passion. It's a crowded marketplace here in Geneva. We do play a modest role, but I think one of the key things that we can do is build interest. We can build an excitement in the accession process here in Geneva, and we can build that shared feeling that yes, we can do this. So for me, it's passion. Thank you, and thanks to my fellow panelists. It's been a good discussion.
Thank you so much. Lastly, Joachim?
Yeah. So I had passion as well, but I had another couple of one. For me, it's personal commitment. So I've always drawn a distinction between professional commitment, which is much like Louise said in the beginning, as a civil servant, you're asked to do certain things and you get on with it. A personal commitment goes so much deeper, and I think that what you've heard from Louise, Andy, myself is something that is deeply personal, actually, and that's something different. And if you're not willing to be personally committed to this in a deep sense, as a greater purpose of doing things, and therefore, and I think that's the key to drive the trust building, and therefore in the end to be the bridge builder that is required to successfully conclude it, I think you will fall short. So that would be my key word for this, or key 2 words: personal commitment.
Thank you so very much for sharing your colorful insights and experience with us today. We have gone 11 minutes beyond. With this, we are finalizing this session. We are hopeful that you have enjoyed our dialogue as much as all of us did here. As a moderator, on behalf of the audience and the future audience, as we have recorded this session, I thank you all for everything you shared with us from different locations. Despite your very busy schedule, we thank you for your tremendous efforts in guiding the future of an acceding member. Please stay tuned for the rest of the Accession week for the next 2 days as well. For now, it's goodbye. Thank you so very much. We really enjoyed this session. Thanks a lot.